fingers. That's exactly right. I didn't know you were from Bishopville.
I'm from Lake City. I spent plenty of time messing around with that tobacco field stuff.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So this.
My grandfather,
Go ahead.
as far as I know, didn't grow tobacco. He was cotton and corn and soybeans.
Right. So this guy that you met at a convenience store in South Carolina was a game warden, and he somehow, some way inspired you to become a game warden. What was it about him?
Well, he would regale us of these stories of hiding in the woods and jumping out on people, and it seemed like an exciting game of grown-up hide-and-go-seek.
That sounds exactly like that. All right.
And that feeling of sneaking up behind somebody and he doesn't even know you are there still raises the hairs on the back of my neck. And there were other game wardens that practiced that art way better than I did, like Victor Lincoln and the Francis Marion National Forest. He could be in the middle of the woods, in the middle of a deer drive, and laying in wait for these people that would shoot a doe for which they did not have a permit. And they would fire the shot, and Victor would step out from behind a tree and make the bust. And they didn't even know he was there. And you had to be real careful walking through the middle of a deer drive because you could very well be shot.
Sure. One of the things that sticks out about that, it sounds like an exciting game of hide and seek for adults, except you forget that just about every party involved has a gun.
That's
That's true, and you had to be practice all of your good manners because you certainly didn't want to make a fella holding a gun angry.
Yeah, right. Now, did you find in your many years of law enforcement, did you find that there were, I'm trying to figure out how to put this. I've talked to other game wardens in the past that tell me they think every little town in South Carolina, and I'm sure it applies to every state, every little town has, one or two really bad game offenders, the guy you really want. And then the other 98% of the population is just the average Joes, the guys that enjoy hunting and fishing, that really aren't out there to get in trouble, to cause real problems. But, every now and then they do wander into a problem. Did you find that to be true? That, there really aren't that many bad guys out there, but the one or two that are, I guess they keep you up at night.
Well, we always found that there was a steady 1 or 2, maybe 3% you could count on to be out there violating, and we looked at them with mixed feelings because we hated to see the game laws being roughshod over, but without them, there would have been no need for us.
That's right. That's right. I had never thought about it that way.
Their antics and shenanigans actually gave rise to the creation of game wardens and keeping us employed.
Sure. Yeah, and so I've always wondered the 98% or 97% of the rest of the population. Are you looking to send a message to those folks? You're not looking to screw them to the wall. You're looking to send them a message, or what's your message to the 97% when you catch them with a fish that's an inch short, or one fish over the limit, or whatever, I mean, whatever the problem may be, you recognize that this isn't truly a bad guy. Maybe he's got a kid with him or whatever. Not truly a bad guy, but just a guy that wandered into a problem that day. I mean, how do you deal with guys like that?
Well, one of the theories of law enforcement was that keeping up a patrol and there being some reasonable certainty that you would be checked or even caught in the law enforcement theory. It was said that encouraged voluntary compliance with the law.
And do you think it did?
If they thought there was some certainty that they would be checked, they would be inclined to be a lot more careful and observant of the laws.
And do you think that did that actually help, or do you think that if you're gonna break the law, you're gonna break the law?
Well, if they never saw a game warden, then I think sometimes they might get a little loose, but there were always some out there that were willing to push the limit, and there were some out there that were really bad dudes. And we had no end of trouble from them and with them.
So tell me, if you remember, tell me about some of those bad dudes. Tell us, you got any stories you want to share?
Well, I worked a different type of law enforcement than most game wardens, because most of my business was in the water and a boat, and we had, I think, the worst problems we had in some of the more intractable personalities were from where you are around Georgetown.
I can imagine why.
The channel net set.
Oh yeah.
And usually ran into them in the darkness at night. In a boat, I was usually by myself. There would be 2 or 3 of them, and their attitudes varied greatly with how much alcohol they had been into. Sometimes that could get to be a real problem.
Right.
And I got a lot of threats, mostly from the channel netters and the crabbers were also kind of an itinerant.
And there might not be a lot of people on listening on this podcast, Ben, that understand exactly what we're talking about when we say channel netters, or even, for that matter, the even more illegal bunch, the deep hole draggers, that aren't supposed to exist but certainly exist. If you've lived anywhere around the water, especially, let's call it Allendale for fun's sake, you've seen those really dark nights in December when there's one lantern out on the water pulling a net through a deep hole somewhere, and then an hour later you see a Carolina skiff coming down the waterway with 2,000 pounds of shrimp in it. So channel netting, though, is sort of a unique thing to Georgetown now. I don't think there are any that I recall. I don't think there are any permits left anywhere other than Georgetown. And you could correct me on that if you know, but channel netting is essentially where a polyball and a net is run across a channel, usually a ditch somewhere in a channel, and for the specific purpose of catching shrimp, right?
Yeah, they would take a net, just like one you would see hanging from a shrimp boat, those big green nets, and they would set it off to the left and the right, so that the mouth was aimed in the direction of the outgoing tide.
Right.
and they would have the tail bag of the net anchored in the opposite direction, so that all the shrimp in that area coming down that channel would be swept into the open throat of the net. Then they would come by before the tide changed and drag a line across they had a big line that went out, that one end pulled the throat of the tail bag shut, and they would pick that up and bring it aboard the boat and dump out all the shrimp.
And in South Carolina, well, in Georgia, let's just talk about Winyaw Bay, which is where the majority of them are. My understanding is there's only maybe 25 or 30 of those permits left. They sort of die with the owner, as I recall. And in Winyaw Bay, in Georgetown, South Carolina, one of the major problems is sturgeon, right? I mean, you get into a situation, we've had an explosion in the sturgeon population in Winyaw Bay, and you get into a situation where you end up with Atlantic sturgeon in those nets, right?
Well, I would think a sturgeon would tear up a shrimp net, because they tend to be quite large. But when I came on back in the early 70s, right, the sturgeon was fast disappearing. There was a legal fishery, which they eventually closed down, but Georgetown was probably the epicenter of that fishery. And I had seen the banks of North Island over there lined with the carcasses of sturgeon that had been caught in legal sturgeon nets and butchered up on the beach and carried mostly to Rennie-Cathu,
right, downtown,
who processed the caviar and sold the meat and the caviar.
You know, there was a time when I was a kid, I could remember there being sturgeon, and I could remember there being giant seashell turtles behind all the fish markets and shrimp markets in Horry and Georgetown County. And, you know, those sea turtle shells were just piled up, and people would take them away. And then eventually, when, you know, it became illegal to even have a piece of them, they disappeared quick, right? They went into people's houses and never came out. And, you know, those days are long gone, though, and sea turtles have come back tremendously, and sturgeon have come back tremendously. So obviously the protection measures worked, and yeah, we've got a thriving population of sea turtles and sturgeon now on the coast, which is pretty amazing.
Well, I think it's not only the protective laws, and a lot of thought went into the implementation and the passage of those, but also the diligent law enforcement, because law isn't worth the paper it's written on if you don't have somebody out there enforcing it.
That's right. So let's talk about your book for just a second, if we can. And one of the stories, I've had 5 or 6 people ask me who was on the podcast this week, and I was trying to consider what to send them to sort of epitomize Ben Moise and his writing. And the one thing that I came back to every time was that story with you and your daughter that I think you wrote.
I love that story. I'm sorry.
No, it's a great story. I mean, it really it takes you through all the emotions, and I think it's a great story because just about everybody that spent a whole lot of time outside can identify with it, right? You could see yourself in that same situation, and I bet I've sent that story to 5 or 6 people just this week, and universally loved.
That was Murphy's Law.
Yeah, Murphy. That's right.
Murphy's Law.
Murphy's Law. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that if you can. Can you Tell us about that.
Well, my
story.
daughter Sarah, who was